Chapter 16, ending with the barber's apprentice. I shall not easily forget the day we went to Bebek, to the hospital where Mehmed lay dying. It was a fine, warm summer day, and from the Glata Bridge, the green hills of Anatolia shone fair and peaceful under the light-filled sky. Seagulls cried in the wake of boats, the big and little boats that rode the Bosphor, so divinely blue this day that the heart expanded with happiness in its human breast. Hunger was momentarily forgotten in the translucent illusion of peacefulness, and when we arrived in Eminonu to board the tram, I was giddy and slightly light-headed from the shine and sparkle of the new and the crisp salt tang blown from the sea. The tram hurtled through the streets in the heart-lurching way of all Istanbul trams. Up hills we flew and down again, faster and ever more furious, with a constant clang, 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 as though the driver and the tram together were impatient of these mean, secretive streets and were wistful to reach the clean, breathtaking sweep of Bebek as soon as might be. So deserted was Besiktas that day that we might have been alone there. On we flew, exhilaratingly, past Ortaköy, catching a glimpse of its white, shining mosque, with the two tall minarets piercing the heavens, the mosque itself looking down over the Bosphor. Down to Kuruçeşme, with its tumble-down wooden houses, over which lay the black film of coal dust from the innumerable depots. Still down until we reached Anaftaköy, the word spelling romance itself, since it means Albanian village. All along the low sea wall we ran now, looking across to Anatolia. Şengelköy, like a jewel in its wooded hills, the long white military school of Kule, skirting the Bosphor, until finally the tall granite walls of the summer palace of the Kevede of Egypt hid the view, and we spun furiously down the single-track line which led to Bebek and the glorious sweep of the bay. Bebek catches the heart with its fragile, fadeless beauty, a beauty which is made up chiefly, I think, of the blue waters that lap the shores and the tall, white-masted ships that seem to lie there eternally at anchor, and the old narrow houses that rise high behind the town. On up the steep hills they march, up to the forests that brood greenly all the year long. That summer morning in 1918, I had my first glimpse of Bebek, and I was transported with joy that such subtle, pictorial beauty should meet my starved eyes at last. From the tram terminus, my mother inquired the way to the children's hospital, and when we found it, we had to wait in the cold, tiled hall until a sister was free to see us. She came at last, efficient and rustling in her starched skirts, traditional white veil bound low over her forehead, hiding all trace of hair, so that today she would resemble, were she still in existence, a surgeon ready for the operating theatre. There was difficulty in locating Mehmed. In those days in Turkey there were no surnames, consequently there was quite often the greatest confusion in identifying people. The formula went something like this: Mehmed, the son of Husnu and Sevke of Beyazit. Clumsy as this method was, people could usually be safely identified in the end, as there were rarely two or more parents with exactly the same set of names, or a child with the same name. When the sister had finally sorted out who Mehmed was, she informed my mother that she could not see him as he was too ill, but my mother was obstinate and pressed hard for details. The sister hinted at malnutrition, and my mother thought about this for a moment or two, and then said she wished to take him home with her. The sister raised horrified eyebrows and said that Mehmed would certainly die if he were moved from the hospital. My mother insisted, and the sister doubtfully went to find a doctor. Whilst she was gone, my mother opened the package of clothes she had brought for Mehmed and fretted that they would be too small for him, but there had been nothing else to bring. A doctor, old and untidy looking, came back with the sister and proceeded to bully my mother, but she replied in kind and said that she only wished to remove her son from this place. I want my child, she insisted stubbornly. If he has to die, he can die at home as easily as here. The doctor shrugged with total indifference and turned to the sister and told her to have Mehmed got ready. my mother handed over the bundle of clothing and signed a paper which the doctor gave to her. We sat back to wait for Mehmed. When the sister returned, she was carrying across her arm a small, lifeless-looking child. She handed the child to my mother, who only, however, gave a very brief glance, saying, "This is not my son. This is a baby. My son is 5 years old. There's some mistake." But her voice trailed away uncertainly, for now she was looking more closely at the child across her arms. And indeed it was Mehmed. I could see the likeness. "He is light like a bird," said my mother wonderingly. "He's very ill," said the sister. "It is wrong of you to take him home." I peeped at Mehmed in awe, at the little brown closed face with the jawbone sticking pitifully out from the fleshless cheeks, the faint dark line of the eyebrow, so delicately traced like my mother's, the skeleton arms and wrists, and the poor wasted body that was dying with hunger. I saw swift tears prick my mother's eyes, but she thanked the sister, and we came away. Back to Istanbul again, in the hurtling tram. Mehmed held close against my mother so that the jolting would be minimized for him. I, nose pressed against the windows, conscious of my mother's sorrow and the shadow that surrounded my brother, and the bright day was diminished for me. The Bosphor had lost most of its blueness. For several days Mehmed lay in a sort of a stupor, with my grandmother constantly reading the Koran over him, and Muazzez and I now and then going to look at him, silenced in the face of such tremendous silence. After a while, they tried to spoon-feed him with condensed milk obtained by my mother through the sewing depot, and sometimes he would sip a little boiled water, moving his head plaintively from side to side as though in pain. If he did not seem to get any better at home, he certainly became no worse. And then a day came when I remembered two important things happened to me. The first concerned Mehmed, for he opened his eyes and looked at me. He looked first at me unrecognizingly, but, after a bit, awareness crept back to him and he smiled and held out his small hand. "Brother," he said to me in a weak, wandering voice, a voice that was not a voice, but a thin thread of sound on the air. I flew over to him, holding tightly to his hand, and I asked him if he wanted anything. He said that he was hungry, and I went to the kitchen for a spoon and a half-empty tin of condensed milk. I spooned it into his avid, greedy mouth until the tin was shining and empty, and he begged for a glass of water. Muazzez staggered to him with the carafe, spilling a few drops over his sheet, and we laughed uproariously as though it was a great joke, and presently Mehmed turned on his side and went to sleep. I stayed by his bed until my grandmother returned from the market, and as she came into the house I could hear Muazzez's excited high-pitched voice telling her the joyful news. Upstairs rushed my grandmother like the wind, and in a loud roar, which she thought was a whisper, asked me what had happened. When I told her, she threw up her hands in delight and began to recite a prayer of thanksgiving from the Koran. She crept across to Mehmed and listened for a few moments to his still, even breathing. Then she said simply and with great faith that he would be better now, and took us with her from the room, leaving him to his good sleep. She had brought back a few uninspired things with her from the market, and presently she told me to go to the sewing depot, from where my mother would be returning today. She instructed me to tell my mother about Mehmed, and to ask her to come home via Turkish, where the shops might have something other than the eternal Indian corn, which my grandmother always bought in Bayezid. She could not get me out of the house quickly enough, so great was her desire to prepare something appetizing for my brother, and she grumbled that her legs would not carry her as far as Turkish these days. So we come to the second thing of importance that happened to me that day. I went to meet my mother, delivered my message, and we walked towards Turkish. She very excitedly said that her son had chosen to live. I remember we managed to get some haricot beans and dried peas and a little sugar, rare luxury nowadays. We were on our way home, just behind the station at that time, and making slow progress along the narrow cobbled street, for this was one of the busiest spots in the city. We sidestepped out of the path of the horses and of men pushing barrows, and presently, above all the streets, there came another sound more insistent on the ear. My mother paused and looked to the sky. I followed her eyes, and there, coming in across the Golden Horn, were three aeroplanes. English planes, a man shouted, dashing past us to a shop doorway. My mother and I stood looking at them, both of us unaware of the load of destruction they carried. People were hurrying by us into shops, into Circujes station, into doorways, but I think my mother was too paralyzed to move very swiftly. I remember she eventually pulled me under a shop awning, and we cowered there. It was only in after years I learned that she had been convinced that day that the awning would have saved us, that if the pilots could not see us, then nothing could hurt us. The airplane flew into Istanbul with a roar, and then came a dull explosion which shook the earth. I thought the noises would never cease. Clouds of dust billowed towards us, and I discovered my legs were in danger of giving way. They bombed Mahmud Pasha Street that day, Istanbul's busiest marketplace, and scarcely gone to defend the city. And soon the airplane had gone, and the scream of ambulances hurtled piercingly on the ears from all directions. We began to go home, having to pass Mahmud Pasha Street on the way, and already flames licked the little shops and the mean houses. A horse lay on its side, neighing horribly, its cart overturned across its broken body, and the driver perched high above the debris with his face blown in. There were not enough ambulances, so lorries were commandeered, and they passed us with their load of wounded, some unconscious, some crying out in agony, and their flapping stumps of arms flaying the air sickeningly. Carts piled with the dead came nearby, and one even passed us, and I was almost sick with horror when I saw its gory exposed contents, heads lolling fearfully without their bodies, hands and legs jumbled together indecently, all bundled in together, for these were the dead, and were no longer important when there were still the living to be saved. They meant to bomb the War Office, someone was saying, but the bombs went wide and fell here, and the people who heard him commenced to boo him, and he was suddenly in danger of his life, for the rest of the people were convinced that Mahmud Pasha Street had been deliberately bombed because it was a crowded district. Still, I remember that day, and the murmurings of the people and the crying of the bereaved, and none of us will ever know, or care to know, for it is ancient history now, whether the pilots went wide of their target or not. And all the way home, my mother's eyes were blinded by the tears she shed for the innocent ones who had suffered, and even for the unaware, surprised ones who had died. That bombing lived in my mind for many years. Even recently, when I had occasion to pass through Mahmud Pasha Street, still with its ugly, unbuilt over scars, I saw that day again, and I wondered if anyone else, in that still overcrowded street, remembered its tragic history. Mehmed continued to thrive, albeit slowly. I would take him out each day as far as the wall that bounded for us the Sea of Marmara, and his brown face became browner under the friendly sun. He had become, more than ever, a quiet, thoughtful little boy, not talking over much, and flinching if one made too sudden a gesture. To this day he is the same, preferring to listen rather than to contribute, rarely expressing an opinion, as if the 2 years in the school in Kadikoy had taken all initiative from him. Summer passed, and the first leaves began to fall, choking the dirty gutters and scurrying along the pavements like prim, frightened old ladies, and as the weather grew chiller, we went less to the sea wall. My 10th birthday loomed, but birthdays were no longer important, and then suddenly the war was over for Turkey. One night we went to bed still at war, and the next day we heard that our country had had enough and was quitting. But for us who were left, it mattered little. We had lost everything. But then there were many families like us, so we had no right to complain either. My mother left the sewing depot, and we wondered what would become of us now. Gold, we heard, was fetching fabulous prices, but we had long since spent all our gold. Those gleaming, chinking coins that had rattled merrily in my grandmother's trunk many years ago now, it seemed. But wait, had we not an old salver that my great-grandfather had given to my grandmother on her wedding day? A golden salver that shone like the sun and was never used because it was such a clumsy size. We had indeed, My grandmother took little time in remembering where she had last seen it, lying at the bottom of the ottoman in my mother's room, amongst all the china and glass which was never used nowadays. Out it came to be polished, for it was black and tarnished, and to be talked about, for whoever would have thought that such a useless thing might now fetch us money. My grandmother was given the job of getting rid of it, for we none of us could ever forget how she once bested a Jew. When she was ready to go to the gold market, she dressed with great care, and once again her jewels sparkled on her hands and her bosom. The whole street turned out to see her and admire the giant salver that bloomed by itself in a corner, a little self-consciously, for it had always been a despised thing, even in my grandfather's day. Now you know the market price per gram, reminded my mother sternly, and do not sell it at all if you do not get the right price. Certainly not, snapped my grandmother importantly, just as though the house was filled with money we had no further need of any more. Off she went, the tray hastily and shamefully wrapped in brown paper, but so eager to show itself off that bits of it peeped through and winked and sparkled at us all down the street. And all the neighbours gasped with admiration and said what a beautiful tray it was, and were we not blessed by God to have such a thing to sell in these hard times. All the morning we and the neighbours waited for my grandmother to return, they speculating on the price the tray would fetch. I was almost dizzy with disbelief as I heard the liras mounting by the 100, or in days 100 liras by itself was worth 1,000 or more today. The old men and the young women and even the children counted up how much she would get, and once I ran into my mother gasping, choking with the piles of undigested liras ringing in my ears. I know exactly how much she will get, said my mother severely. Or nearly, she mended. We had weighed it on Bacal's scales yesterday. So run off now and do not listen to the neighbours' nonsense. And off I went, disappointed by my mother's matter-of-fact tone of voice. When my grandmother was sighted slowly ascending the hilly street, the crowd surged forward to meet her, but I was the fleetest of all and reached her first. I knew the moment I saw her that she had been successful, for she carried her head proudly, a sure sign of triumph in my family. There were many packages in her hands, and tucked under her arm of all things was a bottle of wine. She handed some of the packages to me, but refused to surrender the wine, and home we marched with the excited, talkative neighbours, who were much too polite to ask how much she had got, yet who knew her well enough by now to recognise victory in her step. Well, said my mother's voice at the door. Well, you are a disgrace, mother. How did you ever carry a bottle of wine through the streets like a drunkard? I missed my wine with dinner, roared my grandmother, for all the world as though dinner was still a habit in our house. And what is more, she added, I have fresh coffee here and sugar from the Bourse Nord, so let us invite our good neighbours to drink to our good fortune. In surged the ready neighbours, up the stairs and into the salon, all of them politely removing their shoes before they trod the precious Sparta carpets. They were as happy as if the good luck of this day had been theirs, and helped my mother dispense coffee and cognac, and lifted their cups and glasses to shout, Gule Gule! Mashallah Hanam Effendi! Good luck, God bless you. And we were all overcome with emotion, for the easy tears of old age started to the eyes of some of the older ones. Now we can buy plenty of food, shouted my grandmother, waving her coffee cup in the air excitedly, and clothes for the children, she added, her eye catching mine. And I dreamed of bright picture books and scrapbooks and a box of paints to carry me through the summer days. I do not know how much my grandmother got for that old salver, but I think it was more than she and my mother had anticipated, mathematics not being their strong point. And it is a funny thing too, but when we had enough money in the house again, so that we need not worry for a long time to come, more came in unexpectedly, as is sometimes the way, so that from appalling poverty we jumped comparatively affluent in the space of a few weeks. It came about because my mother started to embroider again, supplying orders to the bigger shops in Beyoğlu. Tray cloths, tablecloths, pillowcases, babies, dresses, all passed through her nimble fingers. She used to design and trace her own patterns, which gave a touch of uniqueness to her work, an individuality that was liked by the discriminating foreign customers of the big shops. So the machine lay idle, relegated to the kitchen, where it was forgotten for months on end until my grandmother suddenly had a passion for making new clothes for us. Muaz's began to look like a baby doll, usually dressed in all white with exquisite embroidery done by my mother and two white bows atop her brown hair. She was developing into a winning and imperious little girl, very like my grandmother in temperament, ruthlessly bullying Mehmed and me into performing small duties for her. My grandmother was very proud of her and spent hours each day on her clustering curls. She is really going to be a great beauty, she would say to a bored Mehmed and me, and one day she will marry a very rich man. You will see. Muaz's, already vain, became vainer. I had become very restless at home and was often insubordinate. My mother worried incessantly about my education, but all the schools were still organised and many teachers had never come back from the war. I used to haunt the streets, playing a corrupted version of football near the gardens of the mosque, for I had nothing to keep my mind constantly occupied. My mother and I used to have fierce and bitter quarrels, and because I could not bear being confined to the house, I took to roaming farther and farther away from home. No doubt, had I a father to discipline me, I should never have dared to do these things, but I would not listen to my mother or grandmother, flying into a passion if they attempted to interfere with me. My mother was rebelling against life too, but for a different reason. Her rebellion was, unexpectedly enough, against wearing the veil, for she had noticed that none of the foreign women wore them, and that even a few of the more daring Turkish women from good families had ceased to practice also. She used to complain about it to my grandmother, declaring she was sick and tired of keeping her face covered, and I would interrupt with lordly 10-year-old oldness, saying I would not have her going about the streets with her face open. I would chastise her too for her many goings out. You are never at home, I would declare, and although usually I was told to mind my own affairs, one day I was very surprised when my grandmother actually agreed with me. It's quite true, she said heatedly. You are always out these days, and it is not right for you to complain that you have to wear the veil. Why, many women are still behind the cafes, and they never see the colour of the sky, excepting from behind their veils. But at least you cannot complain of that, for you tore the cafes from here, and it is a wonder to me you were ever accepted in this street, for you behaved exactly like a fast woman, looking for another husband, or like a prostitute. Yes, you did, she assured my mother's astonished face. And now you talk of leaving aside your veil. Why, I lived for 30 years with my husband, and I never went out without his permission, and I had to keep my face covered all the time. If I went out in the carriage with my rat, immediately all the windows were closed, and sometimes the blinds were drawn too. I say it is a scandal that women today are revealing their faces. God will punish them. Do not let me hear another word from you, my daughter, for surely the sky will open on you for such impiety. Never had I heard my grandmother talk at such length or with such obvious passion. My mother replied, You are talking a great deal of old-fashioned nonsense, mother. My place is not in the home these days. If I were to sit at home all day, or you either for that matter, who would go to the market for us? Do you expect me to stay here all day reading the Quran and wearing my veil for fear passers-by should see me from the street? I tell you again, from now on, I shall go without my veil. And she angrily tore the pretty veil from her face and threw it petulantly on the floor. My grandmother lifted her hands to heaven. I never thought I should live to see this day, she said. Times are changing, said my mother. They will say you are a prostitute, wailed my grandmother, genuinely distressed, totally incapable of accepting such a fierce gesture as the opening of the face. If they do, it will not worry me, retorted my mother. Their words will not bring bread to me, and from now on you will throw aside your veil too, mother. Oh no, no, said my grandmother in superstitious horror. God forbid I should invite punishment upon me. But the next morning, when my mother went to Beyoğlu with a box of embroidered articles under her arm and her lovely face naked to the world, she was stoned by some children near Bayezid and received a nasty cut on the side of her head. After that she was cautious about going anywhere alone, but was adamant about not revealing herself. Mehmed or I would go with her to Beyoğlu, my grandmother steadfastly refusing to be seen with her. The reaction to her in the street was mixed. The older ones were stricken with horror, more especially since they had always recognised my mother as a good woman, and now their faith in her was sadly battered. She was still young and attractive. She was 25, and despite the shadows that lingered now and then in her eyes, she was so unusually beautiful that people could not help but stare at her, and certain sections of the street wondered if she was trying to catch a husband. They came in their droves, the old men as well, to remonstrate with my grandmother, urging her to put a stop to this terrible thing, and my grandmother, thoroughly enjoying herself, would groan to them that she had no authority left in this wayward family of hers. But the younger women sided with my mother, and some of them even began to follow her example. Their fathers, however, in the absence of dead husbands, took a stick to them, muttering piously that no woman in their family would so disgrace themselves. So they put on their veils again in a hurry. Now, if you wish to apply the chastening stick to my mother also, they gave my mother sympathy until she was sick of it, and prophesied gloomily, but with a little bit of anticipatory relish too, I think, that my mother would come to a bad end. And indeed, she very nearly did. For one day in Bayezid, when she was alone, an impressionable Frenchman attempted to flirt with her. She tried walking hurriedly on, but this had no effect at all, or if anything, a worse effect, for the gallant Frenchman became more than ever aware of the swing of her silk skirts and the little dark curls that twined so coquettishly at the nape of her neck. Naturally, he followed her, and all the little boys of the district became aware, as is the way of all little boys, of the one-sided flirtation which was in progress. And naturally enough, they followed the tall Frenchman. So there was that day in Bayezid the very, very unusual sight of a young Turkish woman with open face, followed by a foreigner of an innumerable number of small, dirty-nosed boys. When my mother made the mistake of stopping, trying to explain in her totally inadequate French that the gentleman was making a great mistake, he took off his hat, bowed elegantly, and declared with an obvious feeling, "Vous êtes raisonnate." And all the boys, who could not understand a word of what he said, cheered or jeered according to their several temperaments, and my mother, very properly, hurried on, blushing and breathless, and perhaps wishing a little bit for the security of her veil. So it was that when she came down our street, with her procession behind her, the neighbours were more than ever scandalised and ran into their houses to tell the ones inside. But when my mother called out to them in Turkish that she was being followed, very much against her will, they set off with a vengeance and brought out sticks and brooms and shooed off the gallant representative of Galicium in no uncertain manner. Mehmed and I, who were watching the whole proceedings from the window, were bursting with laughter, but my poor grandmother was quite ready to die with shame. "Such a disgrace," she kept saying. "We shall never be able to live this down in the street again." But in this, she was wrong, for when the street had finally disposed of the amorous Frenchman, and a few old men had in fact chased him halfway to Bayezid with tin buckets in their hands to break his head, the street settled down again. Lethargy, exonerating my mother from all blame. All excepting the old woman, that is. Still, the problem of my schooling was unsettled. It was eventually decided that I should be sent to a private school, but my mother inquired about these. She found that Turkish was excluded from the curriculum, and this made her so cross that she would rather keep me at home. Whilst she continued to search, I roamed the streets, usually with boys older than myself, defiant to all discipline, impatient of the slightest restraint. A few of the old men attempted to advise me, but their outworn, futile shibboleths so infuriated me that I threatened to run away somewhere if my grandmother did not stop enlisting the aid of these doddering, antiquated people. Then my mother had a talk with the local imam, and the decision they reached was very unpleasant for me, although I did not know that at the time. They decided that as schooling was, for the moment, impossible, the next best thing to keep me out of mischief was to put me somewhere as an apprentice. Although really, apprentice sounds far too grand a word to apply in the circumstances, since I was only to remain apprenticed until such times as a school could be found for me. They chose a barber's shop. I was practically incoherent with 10-year-old rage when they told me, and point blank refused to go, but the imam, with indescribable cunning, painted such a rosy picture of my independence, of the tips I would get, of the fascination of perhaps one day owning my own barber's salon. With that, one thing or another, he talked me into enthusiasm, and my mother and grandmother for once having the wisdom to remain silent. though I suspect their silence had something to do with previous warnings from the man, a capable man who liked to take matters into his own hands. By whatever hypnotism was employed, I found myself the next day being taken to the barber shop, only a few streets from our house. The barber greeted me with an oily effusiveness, which I instantly mistrusted. He said in a hissing whisper to my mother that he would train me and see that I did not get into any mischief. "You do understand," said my mother insistently. "He is not here to earn money, but to keep him occupied until a suitable school can be found for him." "Of course," said the barber, in a perfectly indescribable voice. He bowed to my mother, hiding his eyes from her open face, and his enormous shoulders shrugged under his soiled, patched shirt. "I shall look after him like a father," he added. "Like a father," he repeated, flicking his eyes over me, as though wondering just what sort of father he ought to be to me. My mother looked terribly doubtful now that we were here, but nevertheless she left me in his care and went home, perhaps feeling thankful that at any rate I was not roaming the streets that day. I had terrible doubts too. Looking about me, I could not recognize the glowing picture which had painted itself in my mind. The shop was very small, with only 2 customers' chairs, and primitive in the extreme. A copper mangal stood in one corner, used for heating and at the same time for brewing coffee. The window was draped with some sort of muslin, much in need of washing, and the glasses were all fly-blown and bluish with the haze of dirt and smoke and dust. I no longer believed in the romantic aspect of such a job, but the thought of the tips still lured me on. After my mother had departed, the barber lost all of his oily civility and said to me, "This is a good job, my boy. If you are clever and keep your eyes open, you will learn much, and then you will pray for me all your life, yes?" His little eyes snapped at me. As he bent his face closer to mine, I could smell dirt and perspiration, and the blue tassel of his greasy fez waggled with a separate life of its own. "Over here," he said, waving his hand, "is the box where you will put all the tips. When I shave a customer or cut his hair, you will stand beside me and you will watch what I am doing. At the same time, you will watch in my eyes, and when I want soap or towel, you get them immediately. You will make coffee and take it to the neighbouring shops, and they will pay you for it. You will not come back without the money. You understand? Yes?" "Yes," I muttered sulkily, already in a mild state of rebellion against this dirty saloon and the dirtier old barber. "Smile when you say yes," he snarled, pulling back his upper lip from his broken teeth and giving an imitation of a smile. "You gotta learn to smile in this job," he continued, "and if you break any coffee cups, I take the money from your tips, and if you haven't any tips, I break your goddamn head. Yes?" "No," I said, and fled from his upraised hand. All the morning I spent beside him whilst he shaved and cut hair and passed rough jokes with the customers, all of them street sellers or small shopkeepers curious about me and inclined to jeer at my accent. My eyes became tired with the strain of watching what the barber did, and at the same time trying to watch his eyes for signals, although I never brought the right things for him. My head was constantly twisting and turning until finally I thought it would twist itself off at my neck altogether. At midday, I was sent across to a delicatessen store in order to bring back 1.5 portions of haricot beans, already cooked in oil and onions. I got bread too, great hunks cut by unclean fingers, and a half portion was for me, and we ate in the customers' chairs, washing down the meal with water from smeared glasses. The afternoon passed quietly enough until suddenly an order came from a shop across the way for 5 coffees. I was set to make it, but the fire had died in the mangal, so I tried to light it again with charcoal. This is not nearly so simple as it sounds. The barber swore at me and threatened to break my bones, but I had learned to ignore him and placed pieces of wood on the mangal, afterwards building up with charcoal. Then I poured oil generously over the whole lot, to the consternation of the barber, who said I would set the place on fire. A match was applied and woof went the contents of the mangal, and the yellow sheet of flame almost enveloped me, and the dust flew everywhere. The barber chattered with rage, and just at that awkward moment a customer came in, and the dirty remains of the haricot beans had to be removed from the chairs before he could sit down. The barber was forced to fetch water and towels for himself, and alternated between bright, pleasant conversation with his customer and brief, piteous sides to me. I lay stretched full length across the stone floor, going puff, puff at intervals at the reluctant Mangal, red in the face with my labours and oblivious to the fumes and dust I was creating. Finally, the barber lost his patience, left the customer half shaved, and lay down beside me on the floor and blew with tremendous energy. His fat, pendulous belly wobbled over him. I watching it with fascination, and the customer came over to us, one side of his face still white with lather. He gave encouraging advice to the barber, who did not want it. When the charcoal was eventually persuaded to burn, the barber was tired from all the puffing and blowing he had done, and the black streaks ran down his face. Charcoal, dust, and perspiration mingled. The customer started to lose his patience, and within a very short time, they had nearly come to blows. I quickly brewed coffee, preferring to keep out of their way until their tempers were cooler. When the 5 coffees were ready, I placed them on a brass tray with a suspended chain to carry it, and went over to the shop that had called for them. I gave the coffees and asked for the money. They all laughed at me and said, between the spasms of laughter, "Tell Ali Bey he has our compliments." Ali Bey was the name of the barber. When I got back to the saloon and delivered this message, the barber tore at his sparse grey hair, pulled me by the ear to the box for tips, and emptied the meagre contents into the palm of his hand. "This is for me," he said grimly, and I was sad, reflecting that it was not easy to earn money, even tips. "You will learn the job like this," said the sarcastic old barber. "If you are such a fool that you let them drink coffee without paying for it, then you must pay for it. You see?" I commenced to argue with him and called him a son of a donkey and many other choice expressions I had picked up in the streets. "Pezevenik," I yelled indignantly, which even to this day in Turkey is a deadly insult. And he danced around me, threatening to break my bloody head if he got me. I continued to dance with him, but in the opposite direction, feeling that closer acquaintance would not be beneficial while I searched my vocabulary for more insults. Were it not for the fact that a customer walked in, he probably would have half killed me. As it was, he collected himself sufficiently to attend to the customer, but his temper had suffered so badly that he nicked a piece out of the customer's cheek, and heated words flared up immediately, and I crouched sulkily in a corner and refused to hand towels or anything else. Another order came in for coffees, and I made them, anxious to be out of the saloon for as long as possible before some harm befell me. Unfortunately, in my haste to get out, I collided with 2 more customers in the doorway. The tray with the coffees lurched dangerously and deposited all the contents over the legs of the prospective customers. I yelped with dismay, dropped the wet tray with a clatter, and streaked through their coffee-stained legs. Their threats and curses filled the air after me. One man even gave chase, but I was fleeter than he and continued to run like the wind until I arrived home. Even there, all I could do was to choke and gurgle with aching laughter, for the brief glance I had at the barber's face after I had upset the tray was excruciatingly funny. Thus, ignominiously ended my first and last day as a barber's apprentice.